My name is Veshto Kal-Ren. I was a junior handler at the Ossuary Pits on Drennick Station, and I have told this story maybe 40 times now, and every single time somebody in the room stops me at the same place and says that's not possible. I understand why they say it. I was standing 11 meters away and I didn't believe it either. But I want to start somewhere else. Not with the beast, not with the human. I want to start with the smell of that morning because that's the part I still wake up with. The pits always smelled like wet iron and ozone. Old blood in the drainage channels that never fully rinsed out, mixed with the burn of the containment field generators cycling up. If you worked there long enough, you stopped smelling it. If you worked there too long, you started liking it. I'd been there 4 cycles. I was somewhere in between, which is to say I noticed it that morning and it made my throat tighten, and I remember thinking, good, you're not gone yet. Drennick Station hung in the dead space between the Coilworld reaches and the outer arm. It wasn't a military installation. It wasn't a trade hub. It was an entertainment platform, and I want to be honest about that word because the Coilworld Compact used a lot of words to make it sound like something else. Cultural exhibition. Species comparative demonstration. We called it the pits because that's what it was. A ring of stone and alloy arenas dropped into the belly of a station the size of a small moon, with tiered seating for 200,000 and a betting exchange that turned over more currency in a night than most colonies saw in a year. The show was simple. You put something in the ring, you put something else in the ring. One of them walked out. I was the 4th handler on Ring 9, which meant I did feed prep, sensor calibration, and cleanup. I was not important. Nobody knew my name outside the maintenance corridor, and I liked it that way, and I want you to understand I'm not telling you this because I was a hero. I wasn't. I did nothing. I stood 11 meters away and I watched. Let me tell you about the Vurn. The Coilworld Compact had a lot of dangerous animals. Every species that joined brought their own nightmare from their own homeworld, and the pits collected them the way a child collects rocks. We had the mantis things from Sether that hunted by heat and could hold still for 6 days. We had the burrowers from the ash flats that came up under you. We had a Thren spike hound that had killed 9 handlers before it finally died of something nobody could diagnose. But the Vurn was different, and everyone knew it. It came from Galur, a world with gravity that would flatten most of us into paste. Everything that evolved there evolved dense. The Vurn stood 4 meters at the shoulder when it bothered to stand, which wasn't often, because it moved lower, closer to the ground, on 6 limbs that folded and unfolded like something mechanical. Its hide was gray-black and layered, plates over plates, and the surface of it was rough enough that if you dragged your hand along it, you'd take the skin off your palm. It had no visible eyes. It had a wide, flat head with a seam down the center that opened when it fed, and you did not want to see it open. We didn't feed it in front of the crowd. That was a rule. The Compact was fine with killing, but it drew the line at eating, which tells you a lot about the Compact. The Vurn had been in Ring 9 for 6 cycles. In that time it had killed 31 things. Some of them were animals, some of them were not. That's the part nobody wants to say out loud. The pits used prisoners, condemned, debt-bound, species from the fringe territories that hadn't signed the Compact Charter and therefore had no protections under it. They'd send them into the ring with a blade or a shock lance or sometimes nothing at all, and the crowd would scream, and it would be over in less time than it takes to describe. The Vurn killed all 31 of them. But here's the thing I want you to hold on to, because it matters later. It didn't kill them the same way. I noticed it because I did cleanup. You see things in cleanup that the crowd doesn't. The Thren spike hound tore everything apart the same way every time, like a machine running a program. The mantis things drained and discarded. But the Vurn, some of them it ended fast. 1 strike clean done. Some of them it took its time. I mentioned this once to Oros, the senior handler, a big Kessin with a crushed left tusk and about as much curiosity as a bulkhead. He looked at me like I'd started speaking in colors. It's an animal, he said. I know. Animals don't decide, Kal-Ren. They react. And I said okay, and I went back to work and I didn't bring it up again. But I kept noticing. The human arrived on a transfer barge in the third week of the cold cycle. Now, I want to be clear about something, because the record has gotten muddy and there are 7 different versions of this in the archives. Humans were not unknown. This wasn't first contact. Saul had been in the outer registries for about 90 standard years by then, and there were maybe 400 humans total in compact space, mostly technicians and freight crew and a few academics who'd come to study us and mostly gotten laughed at. But nobody knew them. They were a curiosity, a rumor with a face. The compact had a whole file on humans, and I'd read it because everyone had read it. It said they were physically unremarkable. Medium mass, low bone density compared to Kessin or Thren, no natural armor, no venom, no claws worth mentioning. It said their endurance was statistically anomalous but probably exaggerated. It said their social structures were unstable and prone to sentiment. Prone to sentiment. I've thought about that line a lot. His name was Daniel Ovechi. I learned that later, from the manifest. At the time he was just transfer item 44C, and he came off the barge with a bag over his head, and his wrists bound with a mag cuff that had been set 2 notches too tight, because whoever cuffed him didn't know human wrist anatomy and didn't care to learn. I saw him in the holding corridor. That was my first look. He was thin, not starved but worn the way rope gets worn. Dark hair cropped short and growing out uneven. He had a bruise on the side of his jaw the color of a storm. He didn't struggle. That's what I noticed. Everything that came through that corridor struggled. Some of them screamed, some of them fought, some of them went limp and had to be dragged. He just walked. Head down under the hood, feet finding the floor, walking where the guard pushed him. I remember thinking he'd already given up. I remember feeling something like relief about that, because the ones who'd given up were easier for me. They didn't make you look at them. I was wrong about that too. I was wrong about basically everything that week. The scheduling board went up 2 days later, and Ring 9 had a listing. Vurn Galler versus Transfer 44C Sol/Human. The betting exchange opened at 11-1. It closed at 400-1. You have to understand what that meant. 400-1 wasn't a bet. 400-1 was the exchange saying nobody will take this and putting a number on it out of politeness. There were people betting on how many seconds. That was the real market. The over-under was set at 9. 9 seconds. Oros put down half a rotation's pay on under. He told me about it while we were running the feed lines, laughing so hard he had to stop and lean on the rail. Under 6, he said. It'll be under 6, Kal-Ren. That thing weighs less than my leg. You shouldn't bet on your own ring, I said. It's against the code. Nobody follows the code. He wasn't wrong. I want to tell you about the night before, because it's the part I've never been able to explain to anyone's satisfaction, and I've stopped trying to explain it and now I just report it. I was on late shift. Sensor calibration. The Vurn's containment field had been throwing intermittent variance readings, and I had to walk the perimeter with a handheld and log the drift. The pits at night were something else. The seeding tiers went up into darkness and you couldn't see the top of them, and every sound you made came back to you twice, once off the far wall and once off the ceiling somewhere above the lights. The floor of Ring 9 was compacted sand over a plated substrate, and it had been raked flat that afternoon, and my footprints were the only ones in it. The Vurn was in its den on the low side, behind the field. It didn't move when I came in. It never moved when I came in. I did my circuit, logged the drift, everything nominal, and then, and I don't know why I've asked myself 1,000 times and I still don't have an answer, I stopped. I stood there in the empty ring with the lights half dimmed and the sand cold under my boots, and I looked at that thing behind the field, and I said out loud, "Do you know what you are?" I don't know what I expected. I expected nothing. It was an animal in a box. It lifted its head. Not much, maybe a hand's width, but it lifted its head and it turned that flat-seamed face toward me and it held there, absolutely still, for what I counted later as 11 seconds. Nobody was watching. There was no crowd, no noise, no blood on the sand. It had no reason to react to me. I was nothing. I was a small nervous handler with a scanner and a stupid question. And it listened. I left. I logged the shift as routine. I went to my bunk and I lay there in the dark and I told myself I was tired and I'd imagined it, and I mostly believed myself and I slept badly. The morning of the match, the station felt different. 200,000 is a lot of people. You don't hear them as individuals. You hear them as weather. A low pressure that builds in your chest, and it changes when the crowd changes. And if you'd worked there long enough, you could feel a mood coming the way farmers feel rain. That day the mood was appetite. Because it wasn't just a match. It was a human. Word had gotten out. Species that had never seen one were coming down from the upper rings just to look. There were vendors selling little carved figures with 2 arms and 2 legs and a flat face, and they'd gotten the proportions all wrong and people were buying them anyway. I did feed prep. I calibrated. I checked the drain channels and made sure the field emitters were seated. I did my job with my hands and my mind was somewhere else entirely. At the second bell, they brought him up. The holding gate for Ring 9 is a corridor about 30 meters long that slopes up from the substation. It's narrow, 2 arms width. The walls are bare alloy and they've been scratched all to hell by things that didn't want to go up that slope. And if you look closely, you can see marks at every height, from ankle to well above my head. I was posted at the gate control. That was my station. They brought him up with 4 guards, which was 3 more than necessary, and everyone knew it. Compact security, full carapace armor, magbatons, the whole display. He walked in the middle of them, and he didn't have the hood on anymore, and I got my first real look at his face. He was young. I couldn't have told you human ages then, but I know now he was 31, which is young for them. He had a small scar through one eyebrow. His eyes were brown and they moved. That's what struck me. They moved constantly, taking in the walls, the ceiling, the guards, the gate, me. Not panicked. Cataloging. They stopped him at the gate for the weapon issue. The rule was that a combatant got 1 implement. Nothing that could breach the field, nothing ranged. There was a rack. He looked at it for a long moment. There was a shock lance. There was a serrated Thren blade that had been used maybe 20 times and had a good balance to it. There was a spiked bar. He took the blade, then he put it back. He took the shock lance instead, weighted in both hands, put it back. The guards were getting impatient. One of them said something in Kessin that I won't repeat. And Daniel Ovechi turned to me, the 4th handler, the nobody with his hand on the gate control, and he said, in perfectly serviceable compact standard with a rough accent, "Does it hunt by sound or by heat?" I froze. I want you to understand that in 4 cycles at the pits, no combatant had ever spoken to me. They screamed at me. They begged. One of them spat on my boot, but none of them had ever asked me a question. A guard shoved him, "Move." And I said before I could stop myself, "Vibration." Everyone looked at me. "It hunts by vibration," I said. My voice came out strange. "Through the ground it doesn't have eyes." The guard raised his baton and told me to shut my mouth, and I shut it. But Daniel looked at me for maybe 2 seconds longer, and he nodded, just once, small. Then he turned back to the rack, and he didn't take anything at all. He walked up that scratched corridor with empty hands. The crowd noise, when the gate opened, was like being struck. I've stood at that gate 100 times. I've heard it 100 times. But that day it was something I hadn't heard before, because it wasn't just noise, it was laughter. 200,000 throats and half of them were laughing, because the human had come out with nothing in his hands, and the exchange odds ticked from 400 to 600 in about 4 seconds. Oros was screaming from the handler pit, just screaming, delighted, hammering the rail. I stayed at the gate. I had to. Gate protocol says the fourth handler stays at the control in case of a field breach, and I stood there with my hand on a switch I would never use, and I watched through the mesh. The Vurn came out. They don't release it exactly. They lower the den wall and it decides. And it came out slow, 6 limbs low to the sand, that flat head sweeping side to side. It took the center of the ring the way water takes a low place. The laughter stopped a little. Because it's one thing to bet against something, it's another thing to see it. Daniel Ovechi stood at the far edge of the ring. He wasn't in a fighting stance. He wasn't crouched. He was just standing there, arms loose at his sides, and I watched him take one long breath and let it out. And then he sat down. I don't have words for what the crowd did. 200,000 voices trying to make sense of something at once. Confusion doesn't sound like anything. It sounds like everything, all at once, and then it collapses into this ugly rising hum of anger, because a crowd that's been promised a killing and gets a man sitting down feels cheated. Someone threw something. It bounced off the field and vaporized. Oros was shouting at me through the comm. What is he doing? Kal-Ren, what is he doing? I didn't answer, I couldn't. Because I was watching the Vurn. It had stopped. 4 meters of galler muscle and plate, 31 kills, standing in the center of Ring 9, and it had stopped moving. That flathead came around, slow. Daniel had crossed his legs. He'd put his hands on his knees, palms down. He was completely, impossibly still. And I realized, it hit me the way cold water hits you. I realized what he was doing. It hunts by vibration. He'd taken himself out of the ground. A man standing shifts his weight. A man walking hammers the substrate. A man in a fighting stance is a constant tremor, muscle and tendon and fear, all of it broadcasting down through the sand. A man sitting cross-legged with his hands on his knees, breathing slow. He was quiet. I have never in my life seen anyone do anything braver, and he did it by sitting down, and the whole station was laughing at him for it. The Vurn took a step toward him. The crowd surged. This was more like it. This was the part they'd paid for. Another step. It was maybe 15 meters out now, 12. Daniel didn't move. 10 meters, 8. I found that I had stopped breathing. My hand was clenched so hard on the gate rail that I had marks in my palm for 2 days. 6 meters. And then the Vurn did something I had never seen it do. Not once in 6 cycles, not in 31 kills, and I have watched every recording since, and it never does it anywhere else. It lowered its head. Not the strike posture. The strike posture is a coil, the whole front third of the body drawing back and up. This was different. It brought that flat seamed face down to the sand, down to Daniel's level. And it went still. 2 things in the middle of a ring, in the middle of a screaming station, absolutely motionless, 6 meters apart. The crowd noise started to break apart. You could hear individual voices now. That's how you know a crowd is confused, when it stops being weather and starts being people. I heard Oros say, very quietly on the open comm, "What?" It stayed like that for. I've had people tell me it was 2 minutes. The recording says 4 minutes and 19 seconds. It felt like a season. And then Daniel Ovechi lifted his right hand off his knee. Slowly, so slowly, the way you'd move if you were trying not to wake something. He turned his palm up, and he held it out. There was a noise from the crowd, like a wave going out. Because every species in that station knew that gesture. It's not universal, almost nothing is, but that one is close, because it's the gesture of an animal with a hand showing that the hand is empty. It means the same thing on 900 worlds. I have nothing. I am not going to hurt you. He held his hand out to a 4-meter apex predator with 31 kills, in front of 200,000 people who had come to watch him die, and he offered it his empty palm. The Vurn moved. And I mean it moved. That horrible fast fold and snap that 6 limbs do, covering 6 meters in the time it takes to blink. And I heard myself shout. And somewhere in the tiers 100,000 people screamed, and Oros was on his feet and... It stopped. Its head was an arm's length from him, close enough that when the seam in its face flexed, I saw the sand move. Daniel didn't pull his hand back. He didn't flinch. His hand was steady. I have watched the recording at maximum magnification. His hand does not shake. And the Vurn. It touched him. That flat gray-black plated head came forward and it touched his palm, pressed into it. The way a Thren nurse beast presses into its keeper's hand. The way anything living presses into a hand that isn't going to hit it. The whole station went silent. 200,000 people, silent. I have never heard anything like it. I have never heard nothing like that. It went on, and in the middle of it I could hear my own breathing, and it was ragged, and I realized my face was wet. He got up. Slowly, carefully, one hand still on that terrible head. And the Vurn rose with him, 6 limbs unfolding, until it was standing at its full height beside him, and he came up to about the middle of its foreleg. And it stayed there. Beside him. Not in front of him, not around him, beside him. And Daniel Ovechi, 31 years old, unarmed, 68 kilos, transfer item 44C, turned and looked up into the tiers where 200,000 of us were sitting in the wreckage of everything we thought we knew about the universe. And he didn't say anything. He didn't have to.